Sir, you can't just walk in here like that. Toby didn't stop. His boots tracked in slush from the hospital parking lot. In his arms, Noah's small frame trembled, cheeks flushed with fever, lips slightly parted. The boy hadn't opened his eyes in almost an hour. I need a doctor, Toby said, voice cracked, half breathless. He's burning up. Please. The young receptionist raised an eyebrow. You need an appointment for pediatrics. It's an emergency. Look at him. From the hallway, a young woman in a white coat stepped in. Dr. June, barely 30, perfectly pressed scrubs, tablet in hand. She sized him up in 3 seconds. Mud on jeans, calloused hands, worn flannel coat. Noah Carter, right? I saw the name flash. You didn't schedule. This isn't urgent care. You're at Central Medical. Toby adjusted Noah in his arms, trying to keep his composure. We drove over 2 hours. Roads were iced and he passed out halfway. He's been coughing all night, breathing like he's drowning. And you thought barging in without notice was the best idea? June crossed her arms. We're at capacity. You'll have to wait, sir. I don't care about lines. I care about my boy breathing. June looked at Noah again, then back at Toby. He looks exhausted, not critical. Go check in at the ER side if you're that concerned. Lady, I didn't bring him here for debate, Toby snapped, voice low but sharp. I don't have insurance. I don't have time. All I have is my son. And he's slipping. June turned away. Security can assist if needed. At that moment, an older doctor passed by. Gray hair, tired eyes behind thin glasses. He stopped. Toby? The man asked. Toby Carter? Toby blinked. Yes, sir. I remember you. You donated a truckload of produce last winter. Fed half the patients in this place. The older doctor turned sharply toward June. And you turned him away? June's throat tightened. For the first time, she really looked at Toby, at the dirt, the desperation, and the quiet strength in his arms. She said nothing, but something in her eyes finally moved. Let's get him to PEDS now. Dr. Lee's voice cut through the silence like warm steel. The charge nurse snapped into motion. Toby followed close behind, still cradling Noah, his arms sore but steady. The boy's breathing was shallow, skin clammy. No one had to ask if it was urgent anymore. The answer breathed in and out through a child's fragile lungs. Dr. June stood frozen by the counter. Dr. June. Lee turned, voice calm but sharp, a moment. Privately. She nodded stiffly and followed him into a small consult room off the corridor. You want to tell me what just happened? Lee asked as he shut the door. I followed protocol, she said, arms folded. No appointment, no triage, no record of critical symptoms. We have systems, Dr. Lee. And we have eyes, he replied. We have hearts. That child's father begged you for help. June looked away. He stormed in, covered in mud. Didn't even say please. That man, Lee said, pacing slowly, has delivered food to this hospital's free kitchen for over 2 years. Unasked. Unpaid. You ate from his land last winter. We all did. June's jaw tightened. I didn't know who he was. That's exactly the problem. Lee turned to face her. You looked at his boots and his jacket and decided what kind of care he deserved. She bit her lip, but said nothing. Medicine isn't clean, he continued. It's muddy. It walks through slush. It smells like sweat and fear and urgency. If you can't stomach that, you're in the wrong building. June's shoulders dropped. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. No one means to. But harm doesn't wait for intentions. Outside, Toby sat in a hard plastic chair, back curved over his knees. He stared at the small sock dangling off Noah's foot. Lee approached. How's he doing? Toby asked, not looking up. We're running labs now. There's inflammation, probably respiratory. He's stable, but we'll watch him close. Toby nodded, jaw tight. I shouldn't have waited so long. You didn't wait. You drove through ice with a sick kid in your lap. That's not waiting, Toby. That's what heroes do when no one's watching. Toby gave a dry chuckle. I just didn't want to lose the only thing that makes the work worth it. Lee sat beside him. You didn't. And now, people are going to remember what you did for them. In the hallway, June stood watching them from a distance. For the first time that day, she felt like the one who didn't belong. Let's get him to PEDS now. Dr. Lee's voice cut through the silence like warm steel. The charge nurse snapped into motion. Toby followed close behind, still cradling Noah, his arms sore but steady. The boy's breathing was shallow, skin clammy. No one had to ask if it was urgent anymore. The answer breathed in and out through a child's fragile lungs. Dr. June stood frozen by the counter. Dr. June. Lee turned, voice calm but sharp, a moment, privately. She nodded stiffly and followed him into a small consult room off the corridor. You want to tell me what just happened? Lee asked as he shut the door. I followed protocol, she said, arms folded. No appointment, no triage, no record of critical symptoms. We have systems, Dr. Lee. And we have eyes, he replied. We have hearts. That child's father begged you for help. June looked away. He stormed in, covered in mud. Didn't even say please. That man, Lee said, pacing slowly, has delivered food to this hospital's free kitchen for over 2 years, unasked, unpaid. You ate from his land last winter. We all did. June's jaw tightened. I didn't know who he was. That's exactly the problem. Lee turned to face her. You looked at his boots and his jacket and decided what kind of care he deserved. She bit her lip, but said nothing. Medicine isn't clean, he continued. It's muddy. It walks through slush. It smells like sweat and fear and urgency. If you can't stomach that, you're in the wrong building. June's shoulders dropped. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. No one means to. But harm doesn't wait for intentions. Outside, Toby sat in a hard plastic chair, back curved over his knees. He stared at the small sock dangling off Noah's foot. Lee approached. How's he doing? Toby asked, not looking up. We're running labs now. There's inflammation, probably respiratory. He's stable, but we'll watch him close. Toby nodded, jaw tight. I shouldn't have waited so long. You didn't wait. You drove through ice with a sick kid in your lap. That's not waiting, Toby. That's what heroes do when no one's watching. Toby gave a dry chuckle. I just didn't want to lose the only thing that makes the work worth it. Lee sat beside him. You didn't. And now, people are going to remember what you did for them. In the hallway, June stood watching them from a distance. For the first time that day, she felt like the one who didn't belong. The conference room was quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. June sat at the far end of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Lee stood across from her, joined now by Dr. Walton, the hospital's medical director. We've reviewed the footage, Walton said evenly, and heard from 2 nurses who witnessed the exchange in the lobby. June nodded slowly, not lifting her eyes. You turned away a child who was visibly deteriorating, Lee added, because his father wore mud on his boots. I didn't know the severity, she said, voice tight. He came in without checking protocols, no paperwork, no warning. It wasn't personal. But it became personal the second you made assumptions, Walton replied. That boy could have coded in the waiting area while you were explaining protocols. June swallowed hard. I thought I was following what I was trained to do. You were trained to listen, Lee said softly but firmly, to see beyond the coat, the dirt, the accent. But you didn't see a sick child. You saw inconvenience. There was a beat of silence. Then June's voice broke. Do you think I wanted to fail him? No, Lee said. But good intentions don't undo damage. You judged a man's worth by how he looked. You didn't see the father who gave his entire crop to feed people here last year. June looked up, finally. Her eyes were wet. I've worked so hard to be here, she said, to prove I belonged. Maybe I got too focused on being the one who was right, and forgot to be the one who cared. Lee's expression softened. Then prove it now. Own the mistake. Learn from it. Dr. Walton folded his hands. Effective immediately, you're suspended for 1 month. During that time, you'll attend our patient compassion program. Mandatory. June nodded, voice barely a whisper. Understood. As she stood to leave, Lee called gently after her, June. She paused. Don't forget, redemption doesn't start when people forgive you. It starts the moment you forgive yourself enough to change. June gave the faintest nod and walked out. Her steps were quieter than when she came in. Inside the pediatric ICU, machines hummed softly. Noah lay still, a small oxygen mask strapped gently over his mouth. Monitors blinked steadily. Toby stood by the bed, his large hands resting on the railing as if willing his strength into his son. Dr. Lee entered quietly, holding a clipboard. He didn't look up right away. "We've finished the first round of labs," he said. "It's viral pneumonia. Aggressive." Toby exhaled, as if the air had been locked in his chest for days. "If we hadn't gotten him here tonight—" Lee paused, choosing his words carefully. "Another hour or two, and we could have been looking at organ strain, even neurological damage." Toby nodded slowly. "I knew it." When he stopped responding, I felt it, like something in him was shutting down. "You trusted your gut," Lee said. "You got him here in time. I almost didn't." Toby's voice cracked. I nearly turned around when the truck skidded downhill. It felt like maybe I was just being dramatic. Maybe he just had a cold. Lee sat in the chair across from him. The people who second-guess themselves are usually the ones who care the most. Toby chuckled dryly. "I was just scared. I'm not built for hospital halls and forms. I'm good with soil, not systems." Lee smiled faintly. "But you got him here. And that's all that matters now." Later that night, Toby stepped out into the corridor, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows. He found June sitting on a bench just outside the ward, her hair tied back, eyes red-rimmed. She looked up as he approached but didn't speak first. "Didn't expect to see you here," Toby said gently. June cleared her throat. "I couldn't leave. I needed to know if he'd be okay." Toby leaned against the wall, arms folded. "He's stable. Still fighting, though. It's going to be a while." "I'm glad," she said softly, eyes on the floor. They sat in silence for a moment. "I read the file," she finally said. "I saw what you did, what you've done for this place. The donations, the food. I didn't know." "You weren't supposed to," Toby replied. "I didn't do it for thanks." She looked up at him, really seeing him this time. "That doesn't mean you deserved the way I treated you." Toby shrugged. "You were doing your job, or what you thought it was." "No," June said firmly. "I was doing what was easy. I judged what I saw, not who stood in front of me." Her voice faltered, but she pushed on. "I've never had a moment like that before, where I knew I failed someone and there was no excuse that fit, no way to undo it." Toby didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she expected. "You can't fix the past, but you can stay for the part that matters after it." June looked up. "What if I already feel like I don't belong here?" "You do," he said simply. "You're still here, aren't you?" She smiled, faint but genuine. Back in Noah's room, Toby sat down again and took his son's hand. The boy's eyelids fluttered as he slept. "Still here, too," Toby whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "You and me, buddy. We're still here." In the quiet of the hospital hallway, Dr. June sat alone on a bench near the stairwell. A folded letter trembled lightly in her hand. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. The envelope simply read, "To the doctor who almost didn't see." She opened it slowly. "You don't know me, and that's all right. You weren't meant to. I came here with mud on my boots, but I didn't expect you to clean them. I just hoped you'd see past them. You almost didn't. But you did, eventually. My son is better. He still laughs in his sleep. And now, I hope you hear more than fevers and charts. I hope you hear fathers like me. Sincerely, Toby Carter." June exhaled shakily, eyes stinging. A nurse walked by and paused. "You okay, Doc?" June nodded. I didn't know people still write letters like this." The nurse smiled softly. "That man doesn't do email. He sells eggs from a wooden stall. But he sees more than most people I know." June rose, still holding the letter. "Where is he now?" "Left this morning, quiet like always." Outside, in the hospital's new healing garden, a small wooden sign had just been posted near a patch of lavender. It read, "Noah's Garden, planted in gratitude." Dr. Lee stood there already, hands behind his back, as if waiting. June stepped beside him. "I never got to say thank you for the lesson." Lee didn't turn. It wasn't mine to give. You just needed a moment to look harder. She looked down at the soil. "I almost didn't. But you did," Lee replied. "And that's what counts." They stood in silence, sunlight pouring over the petals like a quiet apology. Somewhere beneath their feet, hope had been planted, and this time, it wasn't going to be ignored. The community room was modest, just rows of folding chairs, warm coffee in paper cups, and a podium no one wanted to stand behind. Toby sat in the back, arms crossed, coat draped over his lap. Beside him, Noah clutched a small paper cup of juice, swinging his legs slowly beneath the chair. The boy looked healthy again, color returned, eyes bright. On stage, Dr. Lee finished his short speech. "And today, we honor not just a father, but a reminder. Compassion doesn't ask for credentials." A soft round of applause followed. Lee stepped down and made his way to the back. "You should have gone up there," he said to Toby quietly. "I don't do microphones," Toby replied with a smirk. "You know that." Lee smiled. "Then at least let me read your note." Toby nodded. "Go ahead. I meant every word." Lee returned to the podium, unfolded a note written on rough-lined paper. "I don't need plaques or titles. I just want folks like me to walk into a room and not feel small. I want every child to matter, whether their daddy wears a tie or tracks in dirt. If someone walks through your doors with a shaking hand and a quiet voice, I hope you see the whole story, not just the surface. Because sometimes, the ones who look the most out of place are the ones who've carried the most weight." There was a silence, heavy, full, honest. From the side of the room, June stood near the doorway. She didn't clap. She just stood there, eyes locked on Toby, and whispered more to herself than anyone else. "Thank you for making me see." Toby gave a single nod, eyes soft but steady, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to apologize for the mud on his boots.